Today's topic is one that's been an enigma to many across the world. To get to the bottom of the research, however, is something the majority don't have time to do. I've done all the heavy lifting for you regarding the relationship between chronic disease and sugar, so you don't have to. So let's get started. Before sugar was cheap and available to everyone, there was a time that it was a luxury only the rich people could afford. Now, it's an additive in the majority of foods. It's found in chocolate, sodas, candy, but it also sneaks its way into ready-made meals, marinades, mayonnaise, and yogurt, among others. There seems to be an addiction now, a deadly one, that has been accused of causing obesity across the world and even cancer. First off, we're going to take a look at what table sugar and other sweeteners are made out of, and that's fructose, glucose, and sucrose being the most common. Glucose is the energy of life. Every cell on the planet earns glucose for energy. If your body needs it, your body makes it. And if we don't have any, we die. Fructose is found in many of the foods from Mother Nature. So in this sense, it's good, but it's also added to a lot of processed foods in the form of high corn fructose syrup. Now, this is when it becomes dangerous because it's addicting and it also ages us quicker. Sucrose is basically table sugar, and it's a combination of glucose and fructose together, or the end result. The main argument against sugar comes from a common term called insulin resistance, which leads to all kinds of diseases. The process goes a little like this. First, we consume sugar, and the delivery system that delivers the sugar to our cells is called insulin. When we have an overconsumption of sugar, our bodies need more insulin. But when that overconsumption is constant, our bodies begin to get desensitized to sugar, and that makes our need for insulin even greater, so we produce more. After so many times of our bodies having to release so much insulin, the high energy that it took to get this delivery system functioning is no longer there. And this is what we know of as insulin resistance, which can culminate into type 2 diabetes, among many others. Following suit to insulin resistance is inflammation. All that extra insulin that our bodies have to produce cause insulin to leak into our bloodstream, and the body then fights back with inflammation. Now, it's kind of similar to swelling on our skin after a bug bite, if you want to think of it that way. According to the book Grain Brain by David Perlmutter, inflammation is more than just headaches and knee pain, but has been linked to more serious health problems. Now, the book states that sugar can shrink your brain and impair our cognitive functions. It states that although the inflammation is meant to be short-term, the toxic chemicals that inflammation makes to fight the extra insulin can harm healthy cells as well. And this happens when the inflammation lasts for too long. So rather than inflammation being a temporary thing, it ends up reoccurring, leading to permanent damage to our joints and more things alike. It goes on to say that people with high inflammation also have high oxidation, and this can lead to brain damage, and that some researchers, in fact, are even calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. Now, when we talk about sugar, we're including grains recommended from the American Food Pyramid, not just sodas and candy. Now, according to some experts, even the best grains like wheat bread are basically a sugar bomb and raise our blood sugar more than table sugar. Other experts beg to differ. But does this really hold merit? Now, according to Dr. Mark Hyman, sugar also causes fatty livers. He said in a recent podcast that in the old days, doctors assumed that alcohol was the cause of fatty livers, but then they started finding them in kids. Now, an article on Penn Medicine confirms that this is a possibility. It's not very conclusive, but this makes sense given that sugar consumption has increased from 5 pounds of sugar per capita per year in the 19th century to 100 pounds by the 19th century. Can you imagine what it is now? Till this day, breakfast sandwiches, wheat toast with butter, and oatmeal with brown sugar are popular in the United States. Now, be sure to remember these facts because we're going to come back to them later. But that's just touching on the basis of the main arguments. We're going to quickly look at 4 studies to see if these views are factual. But first, hi, I'm Kim and welcome to the Green Lab Coat. If you enjoy what you just heard and you enjoy living a healthy lifestyle backed by science, make sure to subscribe for more videos. Also, don't forget to hit that like button to help the algorithm. Glad to see you here. Let's take a look at the first study. Now, soft drinks are reportedly the leading source of added sugars in the US diet, so this study uses as its tester. Now, the study was conducted from 1991 to 1999 on over 51,000 US nurses ages 24 to 44 years old, where they mailed them questions every 2 years. Now, an interesting thing that I found in this study is that the higher the consumption of sweetened beverages, the lower of the starch intake. And in the same way, as you can see in this graph, if fructose and sucrose intake was lower, their starch intake increased. And it was these women who exercised more and didn't gain weight, at least not significantly. Now, this may mean that without the presence of starches in our bodies, it seems like something may be lacking, and we resort to craving sugary foods. Or if we drink sugary drinks first, our want for grains just isn't there. Now, Dr. Milton Mills, a believer of eating high carbs, says that our brain uses 25% of our daily energy, and almost all the energy it uses is in the form of sugar, so we need carbs. Now, the women who had lower intakes of starches, think potatoes and grains, were still at a higher risk of type 2 diabetes because they also drank sweetened beverages more regularly. This really makes it appear as if grains aren't the culprit. Grains turn into sugar, so many experts are against high grain diets, but according to Milton Mills, the problem is processed carbs. And of course, this would make a lot of sense. He says that refined sugars and carbs have the fiber taken out of them, and when this happens, it's like eating straight sugar because it's way too easy for the body to digest it. So in return, this leads to a spike in insulin. Now, another problem is carbs loaded with grease, which makes the brain hungrier. A donut is nothing but white flour and oil. Instead of satisfying the brain, insulin resistance goes up, sugar comes down, and then we're hungry all over again, leading to weight gain and an addicting cycle. Now, this is the trickiest part because everything is processed. But apparently, because our bodies are so adapted to a starch-rich diet, we have 6 times more digesting enzymes than any other primate. Now, everybody knows that processed carbs are toxic, but it does appear that our bodies are perfectly well of handling them in an unrefined state. So the study concluded that sugar-sweetened beverages do in fact increase one's risk of type 2 diabetes. But if we look closely, added sugars may be the real culprit. Now we're going to look at a study that's contradictory to this one, and this one is conducted by David S. Ludwig. Now, it seems to show that carbs over fats made people overeat and caused a crash in sugar levels while surging their adrenaline. So 12 obese teenage boys were put into 3 groups and given either instant oatmeal, steel-cut oats, or an egg omelet. They had the same meal for breakfast and lunch, and then told to eat whatever they wanted afterward. The red flag in this study is that instant oatmeal is highly processed. So the results concluded that this high GI food, which is instant oatmeal, made the participants overeat by 53% more than the medium GI food, which is steel-cut oats, and 81% more than the low GI food, which is the egg omelet. As laid out earlier, processed grains digest like straight sugar, so this is a no-brainer. Steel-cut oats, however, do have fiber in them, so the fact that they don't fill people up like eggs would, it makes sense given that any fat is going to be a lot more saturated. That doesn't mean that we have to avoid steel-cut oats for breakfast, as they're perfectly healthy. Lastly, a 2015 meta-analysis of 17 cohort studies concluded that a daily cup of serving of 1 cup per day from sugar-sweetened beverages is associated with a 13% higher risk of developing diabetes. Now, if you don't know, a meta-analysis is basically taking multiple studies of the same type, whether it's cohort or whether it's observational, whatever the type it is, and obtaining the average result. Now, a different meta-analysis in 2017, however, that reviewed 15 cohort studies with table sugar found no significant diabetes risk. So same type of study, tested with 2 different things equals different outcomes. Again, keep this in mind. So we've touched on 34 studies total. I believe most people would agree that the studies done on real sugar are a little bit more legitimate. Although sweetened beverages have high levels of sugar, they're also very processed, making it hard to isolate the sugar. So the fact that a number of studies couldn't find links between real sugar and diabetes is very significant. We have to keep this in mind. Now, the argument of whether sugar or fats are the real cause of chronic diseases, it has been an argument for decades, and we're going to save that for another video. But a big discrepancy that I found in the way that a lot of doctors talk about carbs, especially the ones that are against high grain carbs, is that they fail to mention that they too eat carbs such as wheat and other grains. It's just that they eat them unprocessed and maybe in minimal amounts or at the recommended amounts. They fail to mention that in their natural form, they're actually good for us because of the abundance of fiber. And we need fiber. Fiber protects our sugar levels from rising too high, as well as getting too low. And then going back to what Dr. Milton Mills says. He says carbs are not the enemy, while at the same time pointing out that there is a misconception with russet potatoes. They've been selected to be bred to where the starch is high and the fiber is low, making it imbalanced. So these kinds of things is really what gives carbs and sugar a bad name. It seems some doctors would rather steer clear of carbs altogether because of the modern age food system. Makes sense, but it would be more wise to figure out what brands and labels are good for us. Now, the first study proves that when starches are taken away, many people resort to added sugars. The Physicians' Committee for Responsible Medicine complements the study by stating that because glucose is essential for human life and found in grains, beans, and other starchy foods, we should keep them on our plate. If this isn't telling that we need these foods, then I don't know what is. And going back to the breakfast mentioned earlier, notice that breakfast sandwiches almost always are on white bread, that wheat toast almost always has butter, and that oatmeal almost always has an added sweetener. Healthiest grains we almost always pair with something else because we've been programmed to. All in all, it's clear that added sugars can be deadly for us, and surprisingly, sugar consumption has fallen almost by half since the 1920s. At the same time, chronic diseases have increased as seen on this chart, and are predicted to keep increasing. When we read the headlines, one would think that we're eating more sugar than ever before, but the numbers tell a very different story, and it makes one wonder why some experts fail to disclose this. Whole grains that are unprocessed and still have their fiber are essential to our health, and we shouldn't avoid them. If a meta-analysis that's reviewing pure sugar found no significant risks in 15 different studies, that has to mean something. Although there's the argument that people who lived in reserves hit high ranks of diabetes once they adopted a Western diet, they apparently had an abundant amount of white flour in their diets as well. Fructose is definitely a sugar we want to consume only in fruit. By the time it gets to agave and other things that we think are healthy, it's gone through so much processing that the nutrients are barely there. Now, fructose is the main sugar that leads to insulin resistance. So remember this: Alzheimer's is insulin resistance to the brain, heart disease is insulin resistance to the heart, and so on and so forth. Having a slice of cake now and then is not a problem, but we want our bodies to adapt without it. I'm not even talking about balance here. I'm saying we are better off without the slice of cake. You can actually test your sugar levels at home with an A1C kit. The reason this test works better is because rather than seeing your sugar levels at that moment in time, it actually takes the average of a couple of months, letting you know what you actually need to work on. Now, like Dr. Mark Hyman says in his podcast, quote, "What we should be eating is ancient grains, and nothing against grains, but the grains we eat today are highly processed, pulverized, and are high in the glycemic index," unquote. Now, he goes on to recommend almond and buckwheat flour over white. Additionally, the Yukon Gold or red potatoes are the way to go. Sweet potatoes, yams, and yucca have a lot of fiber as well. And lastly, when shopping for breads, make sure they have the word whole in front of them. In the end, the choice is yours.